Emily never knew much about her great-aunt Marguerite, a reclusive woman who had lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The family had always spoken about her in hushed tones, their voices laced with mystery and unease. When Marguerite passed away, Emily was surprised to learn she had been left something in her aunt's will, a collection of antique dolls, reportedly cherished for generations. The dolls arrived in an ornate, creaky trunk, the wood worn and splintered, as if it had traveled through decades of shadows. When Emily opened it, she was greeted by an unsettling sight. Nearly 20 porcelain dolls, each with a delicate face and glassy eyes that seemed to glisten with an unnatural intensity. They were all meticulously dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their tiny mouths frozen in soft, secretive smiles. Emily was torn. She wasn't particularly fond of dolls. There was something about their unblinking eyes that sent chills down her spine. Yet, she felt a strange compulsion to display them. After all, they were family heirlooms, and perhaps in arranging them around her house, she might honor her aunt's memory. The dolls were set on various shelves, some in the living room, others in her bedroom. Their faces seemed to follow her with a peculiar intensity as she placed each one, their tiny hands poised as if mid-gesture, frozen in time, yet filled with an eerie animation. As she finished setting up the last doll, a dark-haired beauty with eyes like sapphires, she swore she felt a faint pulse in the air, a quick, cold shiver that prickled along her skin. Days passed, and Emily found herself inexplicably drawn to the dolls. She'd catch herself staring at them, entranced by their delicate features, only to snap out of it, shaking off the strange feeling. Then came the incidents. It started small. She would notice a doll facing a different direction than she'd left it, or a curtain shifting inexplicably as if brushed by unseen hands. Emily convinced herself it was nothing more than her imagination. Old houses had drafts, after all. But the unease grew stronger, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the dolls were somehow aware of her movements. Then one evening, as she settled down with a cup of tea, Emily heard it, a soft, muffled sound, like the scuttling of tiny feet on the wooden floor. She froze, her heart hammering. But when she looked around, everything was still. Just as she released a breath, the lights flickered, plunging her room into a dim half-light. She felt a cold sweat form on her brow as she glanced at the nearest shelf. The doll with sapphire eyes was now turned directly toward her, its face tilted just slightly to the side, as if it were studying her with keen, calculating interest. Unnerved, Emily retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She told herself it was all in her head. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint sound began again, the sound of something small and heavy moving, its steps soft yet deliberate. The sound grew louder, creeping closer, until it stopped right outside her bedroom door. Emily held her breath, clutching the covers to her chest, her eyes wide in the dark. She prayed it would go away, that whatever strange force she felt lingering on the other side of the door was nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But then, in the silence, she heard it, a faint, slow scraping sound, like tiny fingers brushing against wood, followed by a soft whisper that seemed to come from the crack beneath her door. It was a low, guttural whisper, a voice too twisted to make out the words, yet it held a dark promise that chilled her to the core. And she knew, with a sinking dread, that her great-aunt's beloved dolls were no mere inanimate objects. They were alive, awake, and watching her. The next morning, Emily awoke to find her bedroom door ajar, despite the fact that she distinctly remembered locking it the night before. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle, peeking out into the hallway, half expecting to see one of the dolls staring back at her. But the hallway was empty, silent. She crept into the living room, her pulse hammering with each step. The dolls sat just as she had left them, or so she thought at first. But something felt off. It was the dark-haired doll with sapphire eyes again. Emily had set her on the far end of the mantel, positioned neatly beside a small porcelain angel. Now the doll was at the very edge of the shelf, tilting forward as if she were about to leap off. Emily's stomach turned as she stared into the doll's cold, glassy eyes, which seemed to hold a spark of life she hadn't noticed before. She took a shaky step forward, reaching out to move the doll back, but her hand froze in midair as a thin, spider-like crack began to spread across the doll's face. The crack deepened, snaking down from the doll's forehead to her chin, revealing an eerie glint of darkness within. Then, with a sudden, bone-chilling snap, the doll's mouth twisted into a jagged grin, and its head turned just slightly in Emily's direction. She gasped, stumbling back. It wasn't just the sapphire-eyed doll. The other dolls, one by one, seemed to be turning, their unblinking eyes shifting to face her, each of their porcelain faces distorting ever so slightly into expressions of hunger and malice. It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The once tranquil collection had taken on a grotesque new life. In a burst of terror, Emily dashed for the front door, grabbing her coat and purse on the way out. She needed air, space, something to chase away the oppressive feeling of those glassy eyes watching her. She found herself wandering the streets, her mind racing with questions. How could they move? Were they possessed? Or had she finally gone mad? Hours passed before she worked up the courage to return home. She told herself that she had imagined it, that it was just stress or lack of sleep. But the moment she stepped back into the house, an overwhelming sense of dread flooded her senses. Everything seemed as she'd left it, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if an unseen force was watching her, waiting. She moved cautiously toward the living room. All the dolls were back in their places, each one frozen in their serene, haunting poses. The cracks on the sapphire-eyed doll's face were gone, as if nothing had ever happened. But Emily's gut told her otherwise. Determined to regain control of her own home, she grabbed a thick blanket and threw it over the mantel, hiding the dolls from view. Their shapes loomed beneath the fabric, but at least their faces were hidden. But that night, just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard a rustling sound coming from the living room. It started softly, like the gentle sway of fabric, but it grew louder, more agitated, as if something was struggling beneath the blanket. With trembling hands, Emily clutched her phone, inching her way down the hall. She barely dared to breathe, listening as the rustling continued, then stopped abruptly. She peered around the corner, and her heart nearly stopped. The blanket had been torn to shreds, its pieces scattered across the room. The dolls were arranged in a tight circle on the floor, facing each other, as if in the middle of some dark ritual. In the center of their circle lay a single porcelain finger, broken off from one of their hands, pointing directly at Emily. Frozen with terror, Emily took a slow, shaky step back, but the floorboard creaked beneath her foot, and in that split second, every doll's head snapped around to face her, their glass eyes flashing with an unnatural intensity. That was when she heard it, a sound so faint it barely registered. It was a soft, almost inaudible giggle, followed by a delicate tapping, like nails drumming against porcelain. Her blood ran cold as the giggling grew louder, spreading from one doll to the next, until the entire room was filled with a chorus of sinister laughter. Emily stumbled back, slamming the door to the living room, her heart racing. She pressed her ear to the door, listening as the tapping and giggling continued, filling the house with an eerie melody that echoed into the night. With each giggle, each tap, Emily felt her grip on sanity slipping. She knew now that she was trapped in a waking nightmare, surrounded by a collection of dolls that had come to life. And as she stood there, trembling, she realized something even more horrifying. The laughter was getting louder. The hours crept by as Emily sat huddled in her bedroom, too terrified to sleep, her gaze fixed on the locked door. Outside, the tapping and giggling eventually faded, but the silence that followed felt even worse, a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She knew she couldn't stay locked away forever. As dawn broke, casting pale light through her window, Emily forced herself to step into the hallway. The house felt different, colder somehow, as if something had drained it of warmth and life. In the living room, the dolls had returned to their places, posed innocently on the shelves as if nothing had happened. The circle on the floor was gone, and the torn blanket was neatly folded on the couch, looking eerily untouched. But Emily knew better. She could feel a malignant energy pulsing beneath the facade of innocence, a dark force that seemed to mock her terror. Desperate for answers, she spent the day combing through old family albums and letters, hoping to find something that would explain her aunt's obsession with these unsettling dolls. Deep within a dusty box, she found an old, yellowed letter written in her aunt's meticulous handwriting. The words were a cryptic warning. They watch, they wait, they hunger. To possess, to punish. Do not disturb them in the light of the full moon. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized that tonight was, in fact, a full moon. Her aunt had known, had warned her, and yet she'd placed the dolls in her care. Why? Was it some twisted attempt to pass on a curse? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, Emily felt the familiar weight of dread settle in. She contemplated leaving the house entirely, but a strange compulsion kept her rooted to the spot. She sensed that the dolls wouldn't let her leave, that they held her within their grasp. Night fell, and as the moon rose, casting a cold, silver light into the living room, Emily braced herself. She turned off all the lights, hoping darkness might conceal her, though she wasn't sure why she thought it would help. She waited in the darkness, holding her breath. The house was silent, too silent. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, she heard it, the familiar, bone-chilling sound of tiny footsteps shuffling across the floor. Emily's throat tightened as she strained to listen. The sound grew louder, echoing off the walls, reverberating in her skull. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to scream, as the footsteps approached her bedroom door. The doorknob rattled softly, as if something small and delicate was testing it, seeking a way in. Then, without warning, the door swung open, and in the dim glow of the moonlight, she saw them. The dolls, all of them, lined up in perfect formation, their glassy eyes fixed on her with a ravenous hunger. They moved forward in unison, their porcelain limbs creaking, their tiny feet tapping against the wooden floor in a chilling rhythm. Emily backed up against the wall, her breath hitching as they advanced, their serene expressions twisting into grotesque smiles, lips curling back to reveal jagged, blackened teeth beneath the porcelain. She felt something sharp and cold graze her ankle and glanced down, horrified to see one of the smaller dolls crawling toward her, its tiny hands clawing at her leg, leaving faint scratches as it climbed. Panicking, Emily kicked out, sending the doll sprawling across the floor, but it only seemed to enrage the others. They surged forward, surrounding her, their tiny fingers reaching out, scraping against her skin, leaving shallow cuts in their wake. In the chaos, her gaze locked onto the sapphire-eyed doll, the leader of the haunting collection. Its face had cracked again, but this time, the fissures revealed something far worse. A pair of hollow, empty sockets where its eyes should have been, glowing with an unnatural, reddish light. A guttural voice echoed from the doll, low and rasping, filled with an ancient, malevolent hatred. "You were warned, child. We are bound to this place, and now, so are you." Emily's screams filled the house, but outside, the world remained oblivious. She was alone, surrounded by the living, breathing nightmares her great-aunt had left her. And as the dolls closed in, their laughter rising to a fevered pitch, she knew that her soul was now theirs to claim. For the rest of the night, Emily endured their torment, feeling her will slipping away, her mind unraveling in their grasp. And as dawn finally broke, the last shred of her sanity flickered and faded, leaving her trapped in the doll's unholy, insatiable power. Emily had become a part of the collection, one more soul claimed by the haunted dolls. Days turned into weeks, and for the neighbors, Emily's disappearance was little more than a curiosity. Her house stood silent and untouched, the curtains drawn, the mail piling up on the porch. Occasionally, people reported hearing strange sounds, a faint giggle, the clatter of tiny feet, a whisper that drifted through the open window on still nights. But anyone who dared to investigate left quickly, feeling the inexplicable urge to flee, as though an unseen force was pushing them out. Inside the house, Emily existed in a liminal state, a prisoner bound by invisible threads of darkness and dread. Her consciousness was locked somewhere between dream and reality, her soul tethered to the dolls in an unholy connection. She was aware of her surroundings, but powerless, trapped in an endless cycle of torment, her mind slipping further away with each passing hour. Every night, under the watchful gaze of the full moon, the dolls came to life again. The sapphire-eyed doll led them, directing their dark games with an almost regal authority. Emily, once vibrant and alive, now existed in a ghostly form, unable to touch, to feel, or to scream. She drifted through the house, helpless as the dolls rearranged themselves, creating scenes of horror that would greet her every morning. One night, as she watched, the dolls gathered in the center of the living room, forming a circle around the sapphire-eyed leader. With mechanical precision, each doll extended a hand, their fingers moving in unison as they began to chant in a language Emily had never heard. It was a deep, guttural sound, vibrating through the walls, filling the house with a darkness that seemed to seep into every corner. As the chant reached a crescendo, a faint, shimmering figure appeared in the center of their circle. Emily stared in horror as she recognized her own face, her own body, translucent and pale, an ethereal echo of who she once was. The dolls were binding her soul to them, piece by piece, stripping her of her humanity, transforming her into one of their own. Desperately, Emily tried to scream, but no sound came. Her body remained trapped in place, unable to escape the dark ritual unfolding before her. The doll's chant grew louder, filling her head with visions of twisted nightmares, shadows consuming light, laughter drowning in screams. She could feel her essence slipping away, dissolving into the doll's dark magic, her identity fading like mist in the morning sun. Just as she felt herself on the edge of oblivion, something changed. The house creaked, and a gust of wind blew through the room, scattering the dolls and breaking their circle. The chant stopped, the dark energy dissipating as quickly as it had come. The sapphire-eyed doll turned its empty sockets toward her, its mouth twisting in a snarl of rage. Emily sensed a brief window of freedom, a last chance to break free from their grip. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily forced her soul to move, reaching out toward the door. She felt a faint warmth as she broke through the veil of darkness, her soul slipping through the doorway and into the hallway. But the dolls were close behind, their twisted faces contorted in rage as they pursued her, their porcelain limbs clattering like bones against the floor. Emily darted through the house, each room blending into the next as her soul flickered in and out of visibility. The dolls' whispers grew louder, calling her back, their voices filling her mind with promises of endless torment if she dared escape. She could feel their cold, claw-like fingers brushing against her, pulling her back, threatening to drag her into their eternal prison. Just as they closed in, Emily reached the front door. She threw herself against it, her soul's faint form merging with the wood, passing through it as though it were nothing more than air. She felt the night air on her face, the first real sensation she'd felt in weeks, and with a final, desperate effort, she burst free of the house. For a moment, the world was still. Emily looked back at the house, feeling the weight of the doll's malevolent gaze from every window, their glassy eyes fixed on her with an undying hunger. She could hear their whispers, faint and chilling, promising that this was far from over. But as the first light of dawn crested over the horizon, the whispers faded, and Emily felt herself dissolve into the morning mist, her soul finally free from the doll's grasp, yet forever marked by their dark curse. And as the sun rose, casting light over the silent, haunted house, a faint laugh echoed through the air. For the dolls knew that Emily would not be their last. They would wait patiently for their next visitor, their next soul to ensnare, their next unwilling addition to their unholy collection. The sapphire-eyed doll, still and lifeless once more, sat at the mantel, her cracked face twisted into a subtle, knowing smile, waiting for the day she would feed again. Months passed, and the old house remained empty, a forgotten relic on the edge of town. Stories began to circulate, whispers about strange noises, flickering lights, and sightings of a ghostly young woman peering from the windows at night. Children dared each other to approach the house, only to retreat in fear, feeling an icy chill every time they set foot on the overgrown path leading to the door. One evening, a young couple, Nate and Lisa, arrived at the house, their eyes bright with excitement. They'd seen the house listed online, its antique charm and low price making it irresistible. They dismissed the rumors, laughing off tales of haunted dolls and ghostly figures. To them, the house was simply a fixer-upper, a chance to start fresh and build a life together. They signed the lease that night, moving in their few belongings, marveling at the high ceilings and the intricate woodwork, untouched by time. But as they unpacked, Lisa noticed a heavy, worn trunk in the corner of the living room. She hadn't remembered seeing it in the photos, nor had the realtor mentioned it. Curiosity piqued, she knelt beside it, running her fingers over the cracked wood. The trunk creaked as she opened it, revealing a collection of porcelain dolls, each one dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their expressions eerily calm, eyes shimmering with an unsettling lifelike quality. She shivered, feeling a faint chill as she lifted one of the dolls, a dark-haired beauty with sapphire eyes and a delicate lace dress. Her face had a single, thin crack down the cheek, a detail that seemed almost intentional, like a sinister smile. "Look at these, Nate," she said, turning the doll toward him. "They're kind of creepy, don't you think?" Nate chuckled, brushing off her unease. "They're just old dolls. I bet they're worth something. Let's keep them. They'll add some charm to the place." But as he reached to set the doll on the mantel, the room seemed to darken. A faint, musty odor filled the air, and Lisa thought she heard a faint, childlike giggle echoing through the walls. She glanced around, but Nate was already back to unpacking, oblivious to the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. That night, as they settled into bed, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She kept glancing toward the door, half expecting to see one of the dolls peering around the corner. She drifted into a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of cracked porcelain faces and tiny hands reaching out from the darkness. Around midnight, a soft sound woke her, a tapping, faint and rhythmic, like something small and sharp against the hardwood floor. Lisa held her breath, listening as the sound grew louder, each tap sending chills down her spine. She reached over to wake Nate, but her hand froze as she heard a soft whisper, a voice that sounded far too close. "Lisa." Her heart raced as she sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dark. Standing in the doorway was the sapphire-eyed doll, its head tilted just slightly, its cracked face twisted into that same sinister, knowing smile. Lisa stifled a scream as she saw movement behind it. More dolls, their lifeless eyes glinting in the dim moonlight, filling the hallway, each one watching her with unblinking intensity. She scrambled out of bed, waking Nate as she backed into the corner, pointing frantically toward the door. "Nate, the dolls! They're alive!" Nate rubbed his eyes, half asleep, but as he looked up, his face paled. The dolls were no longer in the hallway. They stood silently at the foot of the bed, their glassy eyes fixed on the couple, their tiny hands reaching out, as if beckoning them closer. The air grew thick with a dark, oppressive energy, and Nate grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the door. But as they reached the hallway, the dolls began to move, their small feet tapping against the floor in unison, blocking their escape, herding them back into the bedroom. The sapphire-eyed doll advanced, its voice a low, guttural whisper that reverberated through the room. "You disturbed us. Now you belong to us." Lisa screamed as the dolls swarmed, their tiny hands reaching out, grabbing her arms, her legs, their porcelain faces contorted into malicious grins. Nate struggled to free her, but the dolls moved with a supernatural strength, pulling him down, binding him in their grasp. In the dim light, Nate caught a glimpse of a figure. Emily, the ghostly woman who had once been just like them. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, trapped in a spectral form, bound to the doll's will. She reached out toward Lisa, a look of sorrow in her eyes, as though she longed to help, but was powerless to break the curse. The last thing Lisa saw before darkness claimed her was the sapphire-eyed doll climbing on her chest, its cracked smile widening, its tiny mouth parting to reveal rows of jagged, blackened teeth. It leaned close, whispering a dark promise in her ear, sealing her fate. And when the morning sun rose, the house was silent once more. Nate and Lisa were never seen again, their belongings left behind, their lives erased as if they'd never existed. But on the mantel, two new dolls had joined the collection, a young man with wide, fearful eyes, and a woman with a single, thin crack down her cheek, her face frozen in a scream. The sapphire-eyed doll sat beside them, her cracked face twisted into that subtle, knowing smile, waiting patiently for the next visitor who dared to disturb her dark, cursed world. And so the dolls waited, their collection growing, each new addition a silent, eternal witness to their endless, insatiable hunger for souls.